All right, so we're live. That's so cool. My first live. So thank you, Professor Eugne Kontorovich. Welcome everyone to a live interview with leading legal scholar, international law expert, Professor Eugne Kontorovich. A little about him is he's a legal scholar specializing in constitutional law and international law. Professor Kontorovich is an author at Kohelet Forum. He did the fellowship with the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and was later awarded the Federal Society's Bader Award, served as an expert advisor to the group that sued the American Studies Association over its 2013 decision to boycott Israeli academic institutions. He has published over 30 major scholarly articles and book chapters in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals in the US and Europe, including the American Journal of International Law, International Review of Law and Economics, Stanford Law Review, California Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Law Review, and so many more. And his scholarship has been cited in appellate courts across the US and around the world. His expertise is often sought out and quoted in major magazines like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR News, the New Yorker, Los Angeles Times, and numerous television and radio programs. So, wow, thank you for joining us. I am a law student based in Montreal and feeling very inspired by your work and your bio. I believe it is now streaming on YouTube.
Great.
And yeah, it's working. So, Professor, can you please talk to us about the legal basis of Israel and how did Israel come to be? The 1948 narrative there's many diverging narratives. So what's the truth? I know that as a Mizrahi Jew, often my family stories and the story of 850,000 Mizrahi Jews who were ethnically cleansed from Arab lands in the Middle East and North Africa are often left out. So what's the legal basis for Israel? What happened in 1948? I know it's a big question, but clearly you can enlighten us.
Okay, so it's a great question. It's a question you hear all the time. What's the legal basis for Israel? How did Israel come to be? And I think the first thing we should do when we hear these kind of questions is we should think about, is it a normal question? Is this a proper question? Because I think on campus, you're never going to hear a question like, what's Jordan's legal basis? What's the legal basis for the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan? How did Jordan come to be a few years before Israel? What's the basis for Iraq, right? Again, Iraq did not come up from from the ground or come down from the sky. It was a political creation. No country is asked to present its legal basis or any kind of legal authorization in the way that Israel is. And when we hear sort of demands in the relation to Israel that aren't typically made in relation to other countries, it should be a sign that there's a problem with that, because there is no particular way in which countries need to be made. There's no particular legal basis that countries require. But, and in effect, all countries come into being in a similar way. Israel came into being the way many countries came into being. It declared independence from an imperial power, or after the departure of an imperial power, after the decolonization, after the departure of an imperial power, and then fought a war of independence with other countries that wished to conquer the same territory and won. Same way America came into being, right? America declared independence, and if the British had won, there wouldn't be an America, and America won, and there is an America. That's all there is to it. But to go a bit further back, it's really a story about decolonization, and the entire area of Israel and all of the area around it, where Jordan used to be, where Lebanon, Syria, all were, until very recently, until just 100 years ago, 1918, part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, whether that was good or bad is not a question anybody asked at the time, but there was no dispute that all of this was under Ottoman sovereignty. Where did you say your family was, Ysabella?
Sorry, I was reading. My family was from Morocco, but okay. I just know many Mizrahi Jews who were forcefully expelled.
Yes. So Egypt, all of the surrounding area were under the sovereignty of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire which controlled many different peoples, many different religions, and the Ottoman Empire 100 years ago ceased to exist because it lost World War I and then collapsed. So previously, what would have happened if it was the bad old 19th century? The British and French, who were the victorious powers who defeated the Ottomans, would have carved up the territories of the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves and taken them and kept them as their own colonial possessions. But instead, they decided we want to have independent nation states. We want to turn these places into independent countries. Now, these places had never been, in modern times, independent nation states. Lebanon had never been an independent state. Jordan had never existed. They needed to create a transition period to set up governments and set these countries on the way to self-rule. The question is, what are going to be the borders of these countries? What's it going to be composed of? And the answer, like drawing any country borders, is partially arbitrary, because ethnic groups are not uniformly distributed. You can't have a country that does not have some mix of ethnic groups. And so, for example, Lebanon was created as a Christian majority area with a Muslim minority that did not make the Muslims very happy. Syria was a country that combined Druze and Sunni and Shia and Kurds in a way that did not make everyone very happy. But these borders were established by the League of Nations under what was called a mandate system. And the mandate system basically gave one of the great powers the responsibility of engaging in what we call nation building, running these areas while they turned into independent nation states, in accordance with the borders drawn up by the League of Nations. So every country in the Middle East, all of Israel's neighbors, came into being this way. Syria did not exist before the mandate. Syria was created by the mandate. Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan. So why do any of these countries have a right to exist? They were all League of Nations mandates, which were well received by some ethnic groups and resented by other ethnic groups, like, for example, the Muslims in Lebanon or Kurds in Iraq. Or let's take in particular the great case of Jordan. So so Israel comes from the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. Now, League of Nations created a mandate for Palestine. Palestine, they meant a place. They meant a territory. There's nothing to do with Arabs. Palestine meant the area that we would call today Israel and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Gaza, the whole area on the West Bank, the west side of the Jordan River to the sea, and the whole area that today would be called Jordan. That was all one area called Palestine. And the League of Nations said, this area we will have as a national home for the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are indigenous to this area. Not because they have nowhere else to go, but because this is where they are, in fact, from. However...
Can you handle that a little bit, please? You mentioned Israel as an act of decolonization. Now, we know that Zionism is decolonization, that Jews returning to our ancestral and indigenous homeland is decolonization. But can you expand more on a legal basis? Because you mentioned decolonization and Jews returning. It's not because we had nowhere to go. It's because we're returning back home. We have that right. So
nobody has a right to anything in general, but
okay.
Nobody has a right to anything. But in fact, the Jews are from Israel, and that is something which now the Palestinians try to obscure, the Arab Palestinians. But when the League of Nations issued the mandate for Palestine, they said this area should be a Jewish national home, a Jewish state, because this is where the Jews come from. They are indigenous people. This is the source of their rights. Now, when I say nobody has a right to anything, I mean just because you come from somewhere does not mean you will succeed in coming back. It's not a general. It's not a right you can use against someone in general. But the League of Nations said so. What does it mean a right? What does it mean a right? The Ottoman Empire had very strict rules against immigration of Jews. They did not let Jews immigrate, generally speaking. And this is a very interesting point. much of the Arab population wanted to keep these very Trump-style anti-immigration rules. And when the League of Nations created the mandate for Palestine, what special privileges did they give the Jews? None. The only thing they allowed the Jews to do was come in to immigrate. That is to say, they lifted the Ottoman Empire's ban on Jewish immigration. So those who oppose what the League of Nations did, in effect, favor Trump-style iron wall against immigration of Jews. This is the Palestinian cause, the ban of immigration of Jews to the place from which they were indigenous. So Jews started immigrating. Previously, they were blocked. Not that they did not come in some numbers, but the Ottoman Empire prevented large-scale immigration.
So did the British with the white paper.
The British, when they took over the mandate, they were supposed to allow it, but then they basically broke the rules and banned it under pressure from the Arabs, and thus Jews that could otherwise have escaped the Holocaust, most of them perished in the Holocaust. And the whole point of allowing this immigration was to allow Jews to leave Europe for safety in their national homeland. So people who object to this basically say that migration of an ethnic group should be barred. And obviously, when demographics change, politics change. Obviously, the politics of Palestine changed as more Jews came. But nobody would say that if America becomes a minority country, that should not be reflected in the politics, or that America should take steps to be able to ensure that it would never be a minority country. That would be considered a very unprogressive kind of talk. But that is exactly the central point of the Palestinian national cause. In any case, Jordan, I want to say about Jordan. Palestine included Jordan, but there was a provision in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine that said that the eastern half, the part on the other side of the Jordan, where the country of Jordan now is, could be split off from this Jewish part and to create an Arab state. So the whole thing would be split into two. This is the original two-state solution. We already have it. That you'd have a Jewish state on the West Bank and an Arab state on the eastern side. And the British immediately split it. And they created a separate entity, a separate mandatory entity called Transjordan, which they invited their friends, the Bedouin family called the Hashemites, in to govern govern the Arab population there. And thus was created the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So you should all look at the Jordan on the map. No, it came into being in the 1940s. There was never anything like it before the mandate for Palestine. Its borders are entirely created by the mandate for Palestine. The weird arm that sticks into Iraq, entirely a creature of the mandate. It was not governed by the Hashemites previously. It was not independent previously. But nobody doubts that Jordan exists, is a legit country, and its borders are exactly the way you see them on the map. Why? Because everyone recognizes the validity of the mandate. Jordan exists from the same mandate that created the State of Israel. And nobody doubts the validity of Jordan, which arises from one paragraph of that. So in 1948, the British said they were tired of administering this mandate. And they said, we're leaving, we're done, the mandate's ending. And the Jewish government in Israel declared independence and said, we're going to have a state, a state with a Jewish majority. Now, all of the Arab countries said, we don't want a Jewish state anywhere in this area. And they invaded. They did not say they want a Palestinian state. They said, we reject this Jewish state. And they invaded with the goal of splitting it up amongst the existing Arab countries. Not to create a Palestinian state, that was not on the table. And Israel, and partially, they were unsuccessful. So that Israel was in fact created because it resisted the Arab attack. If the Arabs were successful in overrunning Israel, Israel would not be created. So that's very, very simple. It's not the UN. The UN did not create Israel. The Israelis created Israel. The UN did not come to help when Israel was attacked by Arab powers. They actually prevented Israel from defending itself. Now, at the same time, so the Arab countries were unsuccessful in their goal of preventing the creation of a Jewish state, partially, but they were also partially successful. Part of the territory of mandatory Palestine, the Arab countries did take over. So Jordan took over part of mandatory Palestine that it called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Never previously under Jordanian control, never had anything to do with Jordan. They conquered it. They occupied it during the War of Independence. That is to say, they were seeking to overrun all Jewish areas. They seized some Jewish areas, including this one. And Egypt, the Gaza Strip. Yes,
were those areas designated to be Jewish, partitioned by the British in the West Bank?
These were within mandatory Palestine that was supposed to be a Jewish national home. Exactly. They were supposed to be part of the future state.
Okay.
And had Jewish communities in them. The Jordanians and the Egyptians kicked out every single Jew from these territories, including, by the way, the old city of Jerusalem. So,
right.
So the Jordanians were trying to take all of Jerusalem. They did not stop in so-called East Jerusalem because that's where the Arabs were. This was not an attempt to free Arab lands. They were trying to get rid of the Jews from everywhere, and they only succeeded in getting rid of them from certain places.
Right.
Now, the amazing thing is that after 19 years, when Israel managed to dislodge the Jordanian occupation from Jerusalem and the West Bank, the international community said, hey, you know how the Jordanians kicked out all the Jews 19 years ago? They're never allowed to come back. Now, you know, Israel, now that you control this place, you need to keep Jews out. And that's when we hear the word settlers, what does it mean? It means Israel not barring Jews from coming to those places from which Jordan had ethnically cleansed Jews. When we say a settler policy, that means the policy of Israel not to take Jordan's ethnic cleansing of certain areas from Jews as making them permanently Judenrein.
That was going to be my next question is, what would you say to those who call Israel a settler colonialist entity, wrongfully so? What is settler colonialism and how is Israel not that?
Settler colonialism is a kind of made-up term that means places that you don't like. I don't think these same people call Turkey a settler colonial enterprise. What they mean is that Jews have migrated into these places. By settler colonialism, I think what they mean is they're rejecting Jews' indigenous status. They're saying the Jews came from somewhere else. Now, by the way, coming from somewhere else is also not a bad thing, right? Let's say that, like over the next 40 years, lots of people come from Central America. Let's say even illegally into America. Does that make America a Latin American settler colonial state? I think it would be an odd expression, and wouldn't really tell you anything useful. Human migration is an ongoing thing. But I think what they're trying to say is that this land belongs to the Palestinians in some kind of magical, special, atavistic way. But really what it is about, I think the language is, and it totally doesn't fit this context. Totally does not fit this context. Because this is actually the homeland of the Jews, as everyone has always recognized. And the Jews were not at home in the places from which they came. By the way, Ysabella, some people are saying YouTube's not working.
All right, my friend said he's on it. I'll check that. But in the meantime, can you?
Yes. In the meantime, on the question of settler colonialism, I think it's an attempt to appeal to American, to Western audiences,
right,
by scapegoating Israel for the sins of Western countries, in which Israel did not take part and for which Israel is not guilty. So Jews in Israel are people who have come home to their indigenous homeland, in which they had been exiled. Now, many Westerners may feel bad. Many Americans may feel bad at their presence in North America, from which European populations did not originally come, though they have certainly been there so long, I think it's not particularly useful to discuss it in colonial terms. But many Americans feel a great sense of guilt about what's happened with the Indians. Australians feel a great sense of guilt about the Aborigines. Canadians feel a great sense of guilt about the First Peoples. Now, there's two things you can do. Leave and say, we're settler colonialists. Here, First Peoples, here's your Canada back. We're going back to France and England. But nobody's going to do that. So the alternative thing one can do for your guilt is find a small country of people that has been universally hated wherever they're found, accuse them of the crimes you feel guilty about, and make them pay your atonement. Then you get everything. You get to feel good about being against settler colonialism, and stay in New York. Make them pay your atonement. Then you get everything. You get to feel good about being against settler colonialism, and
yeah.
Are we good with the YouTube now?
Yeah, it's working. My friends are on, and I went on a separate link. It works. Maybe it's the wrong link. They can go on my YouTube channel, Ysabella Hazan with the Y, and it'll be up there. It's like happening now. Yeah.
Great.
So you mentioned the word Palestine a couple times, and the Hashemite kingdom. There was the British. There's all these things, though you never mentioned the country of Palestine. So, or has it ever been a country? And this is a hot topic now. What is Palestine purely from a legal framework?
From a legal framework, Palestine is the name that was used for the mandatory territory in the southern Levant. Palestine was so there was a thing called Palestine from 1922 to 1948, and that was the name of the British administration over what is today called Israel and Judea, the areas west of the Jordan River, and it was called Palestine. Had a Palestinian football team, Palestinian newspaper, and it was just a geographic name. It did not mean Arab. Right? It was just the name of a place, taken from a Roman name from the same place. Today, the name has a different meaning, and people want to say Palestine means an Arab country. It's Palestine refers to the Arab desire to create a country in the same territory currently occupied by Israel, which will obviously be inconvenient for Israel, which happens to be in the same place.
Okay, so today Palestine, do they have an observer seat at the UN? And we see what's happening with the ICC. So what is the status of Palestine in that context, in the context of the ICC and pursuing Israel for alleged crimes and today?
Yes, the Palestinian leadership has had a very interesting and successful strategy. But there's some more people waiting in YouTube, I want to tell you. So what they've said is, they've said two things at the same time. First of all, the Palestinians say, we are an occupied people. We are a people without a country. We want a two-state solution. We demand a country. We need a country. We don't have a country. What's it mean to be occupied? Occupied means you don't control things. Occupied means some other country controls you. At the same time, they say, by the way, there is a state of Palestine. We have a country. Take us seriously. Let us into the UN, and so forth. That we have all the aspects and indicia of an independent state, and so we can join international organizations. We can have a president who's treated as a foreign head of state. They want to both have the benefits of having a country, joining international organizations, without any of the obligations. They want to have the pity of being a people who does not control themselves, an occupied people, without having the disabilities, namely not controlling yourself. Now, in fact, the Palestinians don't have a country, but they do have complete control of their in a government. That is to say, Israel does not rule over the Palestinians in any ordinary sense. It does not tax them. It does not draft them. It does not control their education curriculum. The laws, Knesset legislation does not govern the Palestinians. It doesn't pass their budget. I can tell you because they have a big budget item. One of their biggest budget items is paying terrorists to kill Jews. So how did they get this? First of all, because they have their own money and they decide how to spend it. Israel didn't decide to spend it on pay for slave for them. So the Palestinians govern themselves. However, the reason they don't have a state is that they have not really clearly articulated themselves as a state, because they make two incompatible claims at the same time. They say, we're not a country, we're an occupied people under colonialism. And we're a country, accept us at the ICC. That's worked very well for them.
Interesting. So, does the ICC have jurisdiction to is it legally permissible?
No, because the ICC can only take cases where states are in which states join. The ICC is not a world court. Right? The ICC is a court that can hear cases from states that have agreed to give it jurisdiction. The Palestinians don't have a state, and thus they cannot join. Moreover, the places in which they want the ICC to exercise jurisdiction, namely Israeli settlements, would not be part of the Palestinian state even if it existed, because under the Oslo Accords, the agreement that created the Palestinian Authority, Israel retains jurisdiction over all Jewish communities.
Interesting. You also mentioned that Palestinians have the right to govern themselves. So why was there
They do govern themselves.
And they do govern themselves, not right? They do govern themselves in the West Bank. Can you talk
they
us a
govern
bit
themselves in Gaza also.
In Gaza, yeah, under Hamas. Can you talk to us a bit about the vaccine, responsibility that Israel allegedly had, or if it was just a moral one? This was a very hot topic earlier this year. Does Israel have an obligation other than moral to provide vaccines? And what is the health jurisdiction there? Why was there so much debate?
I'll tell you why there's a bit of debate. There's a very ancient tradition. I don't know if you had this in Morocco, but we certainly had this in Eastern Europe. Whenever there's a scary epidemic going around, there's always a story about how Jews are somehow responsible for its spread. It goes all the way back to the Black Plague and before. There's always some story. But now, today we might have thought, I even thought, that we were in more sophisticated times. We'd have COVID and they'd leave the Jews out of it. But alas, no. So the argument was that the argument, by the way, only started when Israel became a leader in vaccination, that Israel was responsible for vaccinating the Palestinians. It's and the argument has gone away, by the way, but it was designed, I think, simply just to inject the Jews in a negative way in the COVID story. But the Palestinians, under the Oslo Accords, are completely responsible for their own healthcare and their own health system. They have their own health system. They can get their own vaccines. They have gotten their own vaccines. And the whole point of them governing themselves is, they can pick their own vaccines. Different jurisdictions have different preferences. Do you want the Johnson & Johnson? Do you want the Pfizer? They can pick themselves. The reason Israel got the vaccine so early is not through any magic. They agreed to pay more for it than anyone else wanted to pay for it. The Palestinians didn't want to pay that much for it, and that's why they got it later. Israel has no responsibility to give the Palestinian vaccines. They can get it by themselves. And by the way, not even a moral responsibility. I see no basis for the moral responsibility. As a matter of fact, it may be amoral to give the Palestinians vaccines, because those vaccines will be almost certainly not prioritized according to best practices to go to people at serious risk of complications, the elderly, etc. As far as we can tell, they would be prioritized by going to Fatah party members, which is not a wise use of a scarce resource.
Interesting. Thank you. I have a couple more questions for you before you have to go. I know we have 15 minutes left. You've compared the Gaza Strip withdrawal of Israelis and potentially the West Bank to the situation in Afghanistan. Can you explain to us why?
No, I think the point to make here is when the U.S. left Afghanistan, the U.S. expressed some confidence that either the Taliban wouldn't take over, or if they did take over, they would be more reasonable than they previously had been. And the United States made an enormous decision of huge consequence based on these assumptions. These assumptions were proven wrong in about, overnight. But President Biden was so confident about them. Similarly, people who are in favor of the peace process, the two-state solution, say that no, scary people are not going to take over where Israel lives. It's not going to become a terror haven. No, for sure, don't worry. We've talked to these people. They're different than they used to be. Just trust us. But we've seen that these kind of predictions can be vastly, vastly wrong. The difference is Afghanistan is very far from America, and America is greatly insulated from its mistake, unlike the people in Afghanistan who are now under the Taliban. Israel is going to be in the situation of the people in Afghanistan, facing right next door, potentially, a hostile terrorist state. And by the way, Israel doesn't just have to consider what's going to be tomorrow. They have to consider what's going to be in 20 years and in 50 years. And if it just takes 20 years for a hostile Iranian-backed terrorist state to take over and be able to shut down Ben Gurion Airport at a moment's notice, that's still too soon. Right? That's because those kind of things are irreversible. Right? So one thing we have seen is that when Jews lose territory, the international community believes that they're permanently forbidden from returning. When they gain territory, it's a temporary advantage that must be returned. So Israel needs to be extra cautious, because if a Hamas terrorist state, if an Iranian terrorist state is created, and God forbid, forces Israel out of some territory, makes certain territory uninhabitable, that we know is forever. Israeli losses are considered permanent. Israeli gains are considered temporary.
Interesting. That's a really, thank you for that. And another question that we have here, a lot of them have to do with the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And the question that was sent in actually is, what are your thoughts on the West Bank under international law to be classified as a sui generis territory and thus not under, quote, occupation by Israel? And is the West Bank under occupation? Is there a military occupation? What is the difference? And can you break it down for us? Area A, B, and C. I know that's a big, big question.
That's a big question. I want to say, let's leave the sui generis. I guess someone took the trouble to use a Latin phrase. I might as well answer. Sui generis means unique, or like legally. Legally, it means unique. Now, when a lawyer says something is sui generis, that means it doesn't fit within the rules that otherwise exist. When people say Israel's sui generis, it usually means they don't want to apply the rules that apply to other countries and other situations to Israel. So, obviously every case is unique, but the work of law is to look at the similarities, not necessarily not the differences. And there's nothing particularly sui generis about any aspect of Israel. Very close in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Very close, and now analogs can be found in other situations around the world. The West Bank is not under occupation. I think that's very clear. And the most clear reason it's not under occupation is because the occupation of the West Bank began. When did it begin? It has been at times under occupation. So, for example, in 1948, Jordan invaded the West Bank, which it was not part of Jordan previously, and it occupied it. So, everyone can agree, Jordan occupied the West Bank in 1948. When Israel kicked Jordan out in 1967, it was not starting an occupation, it was ending the Jordanian occupation of territory to which Israel had a sovereign claim. That is to say, why does Israel, we'll talk about the legal basis for Israel. Israel was created from the mandate for Palestine. The reason Israel has a claim to Jaffa or to Tzfat is because those were within the borders of the mandate for Palestine, and as was the West Bank. Right? The only reason the West Bank did not become part of Israel when it was first, in the very beginning, it was not under Israeli control, was because it was put under a hostile foreign occupation. And when that occupation is ended, that's not the beginning of an occupation, that's the end of an occupation. You can't occupy that to which you have a lawful claim. But even if there was an occupation is a state that exists in times of war. There's no war. Israel made peace with Jordan in 1994, and as a legal matter, that should end all claims of occupation.
So if
Plus,
that, yeah.
yes. No, that's enough on that.
So why is it that Israel is not occupying? Because it was ending an occupation, but we see now that, and you said that the legal basis is because Israel had a claim because of the British mandate. But what about the UN partition plan? Wasn't any parts like Jenin or other places of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, going to be a future Arab state?
UN plans, God laughs. So there was a UN plan, but the question is, what legal basis do UN plans have? And the answer is none. So the General Assembly of the United Nations issued a recommendation in 1947 to split the area of Palestine that had been left for the Jews once more and have a split of the remaining split to create this very complicated overlapping Jewish and Arab state. It's completely undisputed black letter law that the General Assembly does not have any legal power to do anything, let alone change the borders of countries. It was a proposal for a diplomatic settlement that was rejected by the parties, and thus it has. That's it.
Rejected by both parties, or one?
It doesn't matter which parties it was, but that there were partition plans also for the partition of Syria, many partition plans, for the partition of Lebanon, for the partition of Iraq. The fact that someone had a plan that was not implemented means nothing 50 years later, or 60 years later, or 70 years later. So, in particular, it was rejected by the Arabs, but it was also seen as unrealistic by the British.
Okay, so the biggest, I guess, legal document would be the Balfour Declaration. But did the Balfour Declaration include Judea and Samaria?
The Balfour Declaration itself did not have any legal status. The Balfour Declaration was a recommendation by the British, which was very important at the time, that the League of Nations then consider the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. When the League of Nations, which was like included all of the relevant countries in the world, most of the countries in the world, when they issued that mandate, that became legally binding. And that mandate did, of course, include Judea and Samaria. The area of the West Bank was created was simply the area which Jordan illegally occupied and ethnically cleansed Jews from in 1948. That is to say, they would have done the whole of Israel if they could, but they succeeded in a part which they then called the West Bank. The West Bank is the ethnically cleansed portion of Israel in 1948,
okay,
which the world believes should remain permanently ethnically cleansed.
True. So today we see that there are so many accords since then. So the West Bank is divided into 3 areas. And so let's say today, what would you suggest to those who say end the occupation, or is there now another claim that Arabs have to land because of Oslo and because of other,
the Palestinians have an agreement with Israel which gives them complete self-government in parts of the West Bank. So for sure, it's another proof that there's no occupation, because an occupying power governs every aspect of their lives, governs the lives of the people it occupies. The Palestinian Authority governs the lives of 90% of the Palestinians.
True. So I have one last question for you before you go. What do you think is the biggest legal misconception regarding Israel?
I think this issue of occupying power is a big one. I think the issue that there's some kind of general rule of international law that's applied in any situation outside of Israel that prevents people from moving and living in a certain place. Right? There's the settler issue. There's no other area in no other place in the world where the international community says one ethnic group is banned by international law from living. This is not a general rule. This is not something that's like from the Geneva Conventions that gets applied around the world. It's a particular provision that has been only applied by the international community to one context to prevent the Jews from living in Jerusalem.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor. I hope we can do this again and really get more in depth with regards to Judea and Samaria. It was super insightful. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's going to watch this later is going to learn a lot. So thank you so much for joining us from Israel, right?
Yeah, lots of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.